The 2024 presidential election is just 2 days away, and in this video, we'll be taking a look at the 2024 Electoral College map based on the final polls in this election. We will only be focusing on the competitive states as these are the races that will actually determine the 2024 election. Before we get started, please smash that subscribe button for more content like this, as well as real-time coverage of the 2024 presidential election. We will start down in the Sun Belt with the state of Nevada. According to the newest poll conducted in Nevada, Kamala Harris holds a slight 1% lead on Donald Trump. The Democrats were able to carry the state in both 2016 and in 2020, and Kamala Harris will definitely win a state that even Hillary Clinton won by 2.4%. This race will be competitive, but Nevada's 6 electoral votes won't fundamentally shift this election in favor of any candidate. With all of that in mind, Kamala Harris does hold a slight lead on Donald Trump according to the final polls in Nevada. Moving on to the state of Arizona. This was a state that Biden was able to flip in 2020, carrying it by a very slight margin of 0.31 percentage points. Arizona is a must-win for Donald Trump, as if he loses Arizona, he is likely to lose all of the Sun Belt in 2024. Taking a look at the newest polls in Arizona, we see that Donald Trump does hold a very slight lead of 2 percentage points. Now, there are many factors here that will give Harris a boost, such as the abortion referendum and some very racist remarks made in Donald Trump's rallies. However, ultimately, Donald Trump is outperforming Kamala Harris in this state. Arizona will be extremely competitive, but as of now, Donald Trump is on track to win it, according to the final polls in Arizona. Moving on to the state of Texas. Texas is a must-win for the GOP, as if any Republican presidential candidate were to lose Texas, they would have zero chance of winning the election. Back in 2020, there was a lot of speculation about Joe Biden carrying Texas, but in the end, Donald Trump still carried it by a solid 5.6% margin. Taking a look at the polls this time around in Texas, we see that Donald Trump leads by 8% in the final Texas poll. This is good news for the Donald Trump campaign. However, in no way does Kamala Harris need Texas, as she has many other states to make up the 40 electoral vote count. With all of that in mind, according to the final polls in Texas, Donald Trump will carry it by a likely margin in 2024. Moving on to the state of Florida. Florida has really been a special state in the past elections, as Donald Trump barely carried it in 2016, but carried it by a larger margin, unlike many other states, in 2020. Part of the reason Democrats have been struggling in these southern Sunbelt states is with problems attracting Hispanic and Latino voters. These voters really make up a big portion of the Sunbelt, and Democrats have really been struggling with them. We can see this reflected not only in the polls, but also through past electoral history, with Donald Trump expanding his win in Florida in 2020 than compared to in 2016. Nevertheless, Florida is still a competitive state. However, according to the final polls, Donald Trump is on track to win it by a lean margin. Moving on to the state of Georgia. In 2020, this was the closest state out of all 50 states, and this time it is just as consequential. If either candidate were to pick up Georgia, it would show good signs of their chances of winning the presidency on election night. Taking a look at the final polls in Georgia, we see that Donald Trump leads by 2%. Back in 2020, Democrats did phenomenal in Georgia, not only winning the presidency, but also flipping both Senate seats with Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. During the midterm elections, Raphael Warnock was able to defend his spot once again, which shows great signs for Democrats in Georgia. However, even with the strengths of the midterm elections, Georgia was still so close last time that it is within the margin of error for either candidate. Both Harris and Trump could realistically win Georgia. However, for the purposes of this video, we will be giving Georgia to Donald Trump, according to the final polls. We will now be moving on to the state of North Carolina. North Carolina is one of the most important states in this election, with both candidates spending a lot of time and effort in this state. Just earlier today, Kamala Harris was in Charlotte, and as of now, Donald Trump is in Greensboro, North Carolina. This really is an unprecedented election for North Carolina, with many huge factors such as Mark Robinson, Hurricane Helene, Josh Stein, and general chaos across the state. Back in 2020, North Carolina was the only swing state that Donald Trump was able to carry. However, this time it's looking like a different story. Taking a look at the final poll in North Carolina, we see that Kamala Harris actually leads. This poll was conducted by Atlas Intel, the most accurate forecaster in the 2020 election. Not only that, but Mark Robinson has really been pulling President Trump down with his major scandals. Furthermore, Hurricane Helene really devastated Western North Carolina, where voters tend to favor Trump. Even though Trump was able to carry North Carolina 4 years ago, there are just so many factors playing against him this time. With the polls and these factors, I will be giving North Carolina to Kamala Harris by a very slight margin, making this her first flip of this election. We will now be moving on to the state of Virginia. Virginia used to be a GOP stronghold. However, ever since 2008, when Obama flipped it, Virginia has been getting more and more liberal. Back in 2020, Biden was able to carry Virginia by double digits, making the state no longer competitive in 2024. Even with possible speculation that Harris could lose these states, the polls show otherwise. According to the final polls in Virginia, Kamala Harris leads by a solid 8%. Ever since 2008, the state has just been no longer competitive, and Kamala Harris will carry it by a likely margin in 2024. With Virginia, the 2nd Congressional District of Nebraska will also go to Kamala Harris by a lead margin, adding 1 electoral vote to her total. Moving on to the state of Iowa. Back in 2020, Donald Trump was able to carry Iowa by a likely margin of 7%. However, this time, it is a totally different story. Taking a look at the final poll conducted in Iowa, we see that Kamala Harris actually leads by 3. This is a disaster for the Donald Trump campaign, as if he were to lose Iowa, there's simply no chance that he can win this election. For a state that he carried by 7% in 2020, this is horrible for Donald Trump. Even if Donald Trump ends up winning this state, Iowa being competitive is a disastrous sign for the Donald Trump campaign. Ever since 4 years ago, Kamala Harris has really built on her white supporters, which will show up for her on Election Day, giving her a huge boost in these northern Rust Belt states. With all that in mind, according to the final polls in Iowa, Kamala Harris will carry it by a very slight margin, which is a huge flip for the Democratic Party. Moving on to the state of Minnesota. As Tim Walz's home state, Minnesota is not really competitive at all in this election. Taking a look at the final polls in Minnesota, we see that Kamala Harris leads by 5%. This margin was smaller than what Biden carried Minnesota by back in 2020, but it really doesn't matter because Donald Trump doesn't really have a chance at winning Minnesota and its 10 electoral votes. However, if Kamala Harris can win Minnesota early on election night, she will likely win the 2024 election, as winning Minnesota early can be great signs for her across the whole Rust Belt. Keeping all of that in mind, according to the final polls in Minnesota, Kamala Harris will carry the state by a lean margin in the 2024 election. Moving on to the state of Wisconsin. Out of the 3 Rust Belt states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, Wisconsin was the closest state out of the 3, with Biden only carrying it by 0.6%. However, Wisconsin is made up of a huge white population, more than both in Michigan and in Pennsylvania. And Kamala Harris has actually been building her support on white voters, which is why she's actually doing better than Biden was 4 years ago in Wisconsin. According to the final poll conducted in Wisconsin, we see that Kamala Harris leads by 2%. The polling in 2020 did favor Democrats, however this time around, the corrections match it with other states, such as Michigan and Pennsylvania. Not only that, but the Rust Belt tends to vote together in most of the presidential elections. With many different factors in mind, Kamala Harris is slightly favored to win Wisconsin, and according to the final poll, she will carry it by a slight margin in the 2024 election. Moving on to the state of Michigan. Unlike Wisconsin, Biden actually carried Michigan by a lean margin back in 2020. Out of the 3 Rust Belt states, Michigan is the most liberal out of all of them, with Biden carrying it by 2.8%. Donald Trump really spent a lot of time and effort in Michigan, but he ended up coming out short. According to the final polls in Michigan, besides for the 2 polls showing an even race, Kamala Harris leads in almost every other one of them, showing great signs for her in Michigan. Demographically, like Wisconsin, the white voter base that she has built will not only give her a boost in Wisconsin and Michigan, but in all of these northern Rust Belt states. And even if Donald Trump does improve from 2020, it is extremely unlikely for him to make up a 2.8% gap in which he lost Michigan by in 2020. With all of that in mind, according to the final polls in Michigan, Kamala Harris will win it by a very, very slight margin. Moving on to the state of Pennsylvania. This is the most important state for both candidates, and it is a must-win for the Kamala Harris campaign. Whoever wins Pennsylvania will likely win the presidential election as well. With Pennsylvania's crucial 19 electoral votes, let's take a look at who leads in the final polls. Taking a look at the final poll in Pennsylvania, it is a poll conducted by Red Eagle Politics, a partisan Republican biased poll, and even they show Kamala Harris up by 2%. This is just so bad for the Donald Trump campaign, as it is extremely rare for a partisan pollster to show the opposing party candidate leading in a state like Pennsylvania. Not only that, but it seems like Kamala Harris is performing very well in all of these Rust Belt states, including Pennsylvania. Back in 2020, Biden was able to carry Pennsylvania by 1.2%, which is a good cushion for Kamala Harris even if Donald Trump were to improve. There are many factors favoring both candidates in Pennsylvania, but ultimately, I do think that Kamala Harris is the favorite to win. And according to the final poll, which is conducted by a partisan Republican pollster, Kamala Harris is on track to carry Pennsylvania in its 19 electoral votes. And with Pennsylvania filled out, we have one state left on this map, the state of New Hampshire. According to the final poll in New Hampshire, Kamala Harris leads by a solid 5% margin. Back in 2020, Biden carried New Hampshire by double digits, and even though Harris isn't at that point as of now, it really doesn't matter, as she has already swept the Rust Belt and even flipped North Carolina and Iowa in this pollster prediction. And that is the 2024 presidential election map based on the final polls conducted in every single state. Kamala Harris stands at 298 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 240 electoral votes. Thank you guys so much for watching, and please smash that subscribe button for more content like this, as well as real-time coverage of the 2024 presidential election this Tuesday. Thank you guys for watching.